Well, our Christmas tree is still up, and bets are still being taken on whether it will come down before Lent in early March or stay on up into June, becoming a kind of offering to spiders and their webs. That bit I just said about bets still being taken isn't true, but the rest, and I mean, really, maybe there's good reason to leave the tree up. At first, we were leaving it up because we'd gotten it up later than this year than we usually do, and then I got sick right about the time when we would have taken it down at that little festival called Epiphany. But now, I mean, with things going the way they are in this country and world, maybe we're going to need a little Christmas all year round. Right? Sometimes, some weeks are just too much. Like a week when a whole bunch of the very best of the aspiring figure skaters and their coaches all tragically die from a mid-air collision with an army helicopter whose occupants are also all dead. Like a week when the now one of the most powerful men in the world, the new President of the United States, turns off necessary governmental help temporarily and more permanently to some of those most in need in this country and around the world. We Christians would call this kind of help loving our neighbor. And threatens to cut off more support with organizations like FEMA. And then there's the little thing where our president and far too many other people are blowing up social media with sensationalist and false statements to the point where this is becoming normalized. Some weeks are just too much. And right now in the world, there seem to be far too many people of all different beliefs and backgrounds living high on hate and self-aggrandizement. Nothing could be further away from what we should be striving for in this world and our lives. In our first lesson from 1 Corinthians today, we hear the Apostle Paul chastising the early Christian church that he had founded in Corinth because they were not living up to their Christian calling in how they behaved with and treated one another. How we behave towards other human beings matters. Go figure. And especially for any of us striving to build lives as Christ's disciples. Our behavior should demonstrate our efforts to reflect Christ's fierce and awesome love. At least in whatever small ways God can help us manage this, so that others may come too to sing God's praises as they live their own lives and know that they can look to God as their refuge in times of trouble, like our psalmist today, who wrote, "In you, Lord, I take refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver me and rescue me. Incline your ear to me and save me. Be to me a rock of refuge, a strong fortress to save me, for you are my rock and my fortress. Rescue me, O my God, from the hand of the wicked, from the grasp of the unjust and cruel. For you, O Lord, are my hope, my trust. O Lord, from my youth, from my birth, I have leaned upon you, my protector since my mother's womb. My praise is continually of you." Yes, we can and should look to God as our refuge. And when the world and our lives seem to get crazier and crazier, we nevertheless have clear guideposts for how we should seek to behave in texts like this one from 1 Corinthians. most often perhaps heard at wedding ceremonies. These words written to the early Christian church in Corinth remind us that if our lives and words do not reflect God's love, then we are like clanging cymbals, noisy gongs. Well, isn't that the truth? There certainly are a lot of noisy gongs getting airtime these days. And there, but for the grace of God, go any of us. We need to be careful, lest we think that any among us, myself included, are without blame, without areas in which we need God's help in Christ to be resurrected from what we are, so that we might become more like the love described here by Paul. Patient, kind, not envious, not boastful, not rude, and rejoicing in truth, and possessing endurance for the long haul. Yes, even as we must find ways to rise up for the sake of building a world that more fully reflects the justice-seeking love and mercy of God in Christ, we need to be careful that we too do not slip into the false notion that we, any of us, know it all, get it all right, or in some way have a privileged position as people or as Christians. Jesus stands right there in the middle of his hometown and declares that God's work of grace is bigger than our belief systems and racial and ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Jesus points out that though people gathered in his hometown might be hoping to see some miracles of their own, God's healing and providential work came to the widow at Zarephath in another town, and only to her in the midst of a famine hitting the entire land, and to Naaman, who was a Syrian, not even from their own country, the only person healed. No wonder Jesus' hometown folks try to run him off a cliff. Jesus is telling them to check their privilege at the door. God's grace is bigger than any boundaries we as humans set. Oh, nothing can make us as humans more upset and more angry than telling us to check our privilege at the door. Yep. So maybe it's small wonder that Jesus' hometown crew go from being amazed, we hear, at the gracious words of Jesus, to being infuriated by Jesus suggesting that God's grace is bigger and more expansive than they had understood it to be. So infuriated that they became a mob that tries to run Jesus off the cliff. And there, but for the grace of God, go we. Consider for a moment how you might respond if someone told you that something you dearly believe deserves to be reconsidered. That your deepest roots were not in those who think and look like you, but in a God whose love is so expansive that it chooses again and again to cross humanly perceived boundaries and offer life and healing and restoration. And God, who would send God's own self to become fully human in Jesus, born long ago in a manger to an unwed teenage mother, born not to privilege and power, but amidst the animals' droppings and feed. Maybe that's why I want to keep the Christmas tree up a little bit longer. Just a little bit longer. To meditate on God's selfless love that is so contrary to the selfishness that can take center stage in us as humans, me included. To meditate on God's boundary-crossing love that will not let us go, but which instead humbles itself to take on human form in a babe born in a manger. And yet, there is more, still more to this remarkable story than what we remember with our Christmas trees. Jesus does not stop crossing boundaries with his birth. Jesus does not stop crossing boundaries in his hometown to point the people to God's more expansive mercy. No! Jesus will not stop crossing boundaries until he climbs to the cross, where Jesus will take on all the suffering of all the people and this whole created world that God so desperately loves. Crossing over the threshold of death, Christ will then cross the final boundary back to life, making possible resurrected life and a promise that all of us have the potential to be more, to become something beyond what we have understood ourselves and this world to be. And that is the fuel that has energized movements such as abolitionists and the civil rights in this country, or the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, or the people who risked their lives in the midst of the Nazi regime taking power in Germany, who risked their lives to speak truth to power, to smuggle those most in danger to safety, and to try to rebuild after the ravages of war had finally passed. Who is this Jesus? Yes, the son of Mary, the teenage mother, and of the carpenter Joseph. But most of all, the Son of God, who did not and does not stay distant from this world's suffering, but seeks even now to break in upon this twisted narrative so that the light of the resurrection promise of God in Christ for this world and all of her people might shine forth. So, do what you must to keep your spirits up. Leave the Christmas tree up if you want. But also gather in communities like this one to keep struggling and growing and doggedly committing ourselves to the hard work of following Jesus, who does not ever leave us comfortably sitting as bystanders in our hometown, but invites us to the edge of the cliff, where what we thought we believed and knew might have to be let go, but where we shall discover that grace will be sufficient for the day and the work we have before us.